the portkey dropped them all at once. That was the problem with large family travel, Bill had long since decided. Not the distance, not the paperwork, not even the 3 separate permission forms the Egyptian ministry required for minors entering through unauthorized portkey corridors. The problem was that 7 people arriving by portkey simultaneously was less a journey and more a small, wool-clad catastrophe. They came in low, the way portkeys often did when the landing coordinates were slightly misaligned, and arrived in a burst of tangled limbs and luggage approximately 4 feet above the ground. What followed was not graceful. Fred landed on his feet, which he would mention repeatedly for the rest of the holiday. George did not. Ron's trunk hit the earth a half-second before Ron did, and the latch, which had been temperamental since Christmas, gave up entirely. 3 pairs of socks, a copy of Flying with the Cannons, and a half-eaten packet of chocolate frogs scattered across the pale dust. Percy, who had managed to land upright through sheer determination and the good fortune of having grabbed Bill's shoulder during transit, immediately released said shoulder and straightened his robes as though nothing had happened. Ginny came down sideways, caught herself on one hand, and was standing again before most of them had finished falling. Mrs. Weasley arrived already speaking. "Told you we should have confirmed the coordinates, Arthur. I said it twice on Tuesday and once again this morning. And now look. Molly, we're here. That's the main thing. George's elbow is bleeding. It's fine, Mum. It is not fine. It's..." Bill watched all of this from a distance of about 10 yards, leaning against a low stone wall with his arms crossed, a slow smile on his face. He had arrived in Egypt 18 months ago and had grown into the heat the way people sometimes did when a place suited them. Quietly, gradually, until it seemed like it had always been true. His hair was longer than their mother would like. His robes were the lightweight linen kind, the color of sand, and he wore them unbuttoned over a plain shirt. There was a leather satchel over one shoulder, worn soft with use, and several things hanging from his belt that did not bear immediate examination. He waited until the immediate chaos had reached its natural plateau, the point at which everyone was upright, mostly accounted for, and the loudest complaints had subsided to a manageable volume, before he pushed off from the wall and walked toward them. "You're 4 minutes late," he said. Arthur Weasley looked up from where he was helping Ron collect scattered belongings, and his face did the thing it always did when he saw one of his children after a long absence. A brief, unguarded softening, followed quickly by the effort not to show how much it meant. "Bill," he said, and shook his son's hand, and then abandoned the handshake for something that was clearly going to be a hug, regardless of whatever either of them intended. Bill let it happen. Mrs. Weasley reached them next, and what followed was less a greeting than a comprehensive physical inspection conducted at close range, during which Bill stood patiently and answered questions about whether he was eating, whether he was sleeping, and whether that was a scar on his forearm. He confirmed that he was eating, that he was generally sleeping, and that the forearm was a minor occupational thing from 3 weeks ago and was entirely healed and not worth mentioning. "You mentioned it," his mother pointed out. "You were going to find it anyway." She touched it once, briefly, then let go. The twins descended on Bill with cheerful violence, each grabbing one arm, and there was a brief, affectionate struggle that ended when Ginny slipped between them and hugged him properly, her arms around his middle, her head against his shoulder for just a moment before she stepped back and squinted, going up at him. "You're taller," she said. "I'm not." "You look taller. It's the light." She considered this with the particular seriousness she applied to things she wasn't sure she believed, and then seemed to accept it as a reasonable explanation for the time being. Percy had, during the reunion, collected his own trunk, ensured its contents were undisturbed, and produced from his front pocket a folded piece of parchment which he now held out to Bill with an expression of careful importance. "I've brought the ministry correspondence," he said, "for the liaison meeting. I thought, given that you have an established working relationship with the Egyptian Department of Magical Antiquities, it would make sense to—" "Percy," Bill said, taking the parchment and tucking it into his satchel without looking at it. "You're 15. 16 in August. We're here on holiday." Percy opened his mouth. "The parchment will keep," Bill said, and Percy closed his mouth. And that was that. They walked. The portkey had deposited them on the outskirts of what Bill called, without further elaboration, the safe zone, a broad area of scrubland and pale earth at the edge of the older part of the city, where magical traffic was routed to avoid overlapping with the Muggle districts nearby. The walk to the house where Bill was staying, a narrow building in a wizarding neighborhood that leaned slightly, as though considering a nap, took about 20 minutes, and it was the kind of walk that arrived without announcement. The heat was the first thing, not the aggressive heat of high summer, but something older and more constant, a warmth that had been present so long it had become structural, baked into the stones and the earth and the pale sky overhead. Ginny felt it settle against her arms and the back of her neck like a second layer of clothing. Not unpleasant, just insistent. The sounds were different here. Not absent. There was plenty of noise. The distant call of something that might have been a bird. The low, layered murmur of a city going about its business. But the sounds sat differently in the air. They didn't bounce the way sounds did in England. They spread out and were absorbed. Ron walked beside her for a while, his trunk hovering slightly behind him, making a faint dragging sound where the corner occasionally touched the ground. He was looking at everything with the expression he wore when he was trying not to look too obviously interested. "It's big," he said. "It's a city," Ginny said. "No, I mean—" He gestured vaguely at the sky, which was a blue so deep and uninterrupted it looked almost unreal, like something painted. "All of it." Ginny looked up at it. She knew what he meant. Their father had already fallen slightly behind the group. He had noticed, partway down the first street, a section of wall where the stone was carved, with small repeating symbols. Not hieroglyphics, or not only hieroglyphics, but something interspersed with them that might have been a magical notation system of some kind. He was standing very close to it, with his hands clasped behind his back, his head tilted at the angle that meant he was restraining himself from touching something. Bill doubled back without being asked. He stood beside his father for a moment, looking at the wall. "Pre-dynastic," Bill said. "Probably. The glyph system is older than the stonework, which is either a very sophisticated forgery or a genuine transplant. My team thinks transplant." Arthur made a low, reverent sound. "The enchantment on it is still partially active," Bill added. Don't touch. I wasn't going to touch. Dad, I wasn't, Arthur said with dignity, and then followed Bill back to the group at a pace only slightly slower than necessary. Bill's house was narrow and tall and cool inside, the walls thick enough to hold the morning's lower temperature well into the afternoon. There was a staircase that turned twice for no architectural reason, a kitchen that smelled of cardamom and something mineral and faintly smoky, and a sitting room on the first floor where a ceiling fan moved the air in slow, steady circles. Mrs. Weasley assessed the kitchen in approximately 45 seconds and began reorganizing it. Fred and George disappeared upstairs to investigate the sleeping arrangements, and a brief dispute about who got the room with the window could be heard filtering down through the ceiling, followed by an agreement that suggested some kind of exchange had been reached. Percy established himself at a small desk in the corner of the sitting room and produced a fresh piece of parchment. Ron sat down heavily on a low sofa and immediately fell 3/4 asleep. Ginny drifted to the window. The street below was narrow and busy in the specific way of places that had always been narrow and busy. The busyness worn in, routine, unremarkable to the people who lived it. A woman walked past with a basket balanced on her head, not looking at it. 2 men were talking outside the building opposite, one of them occasionally gesturing toward the upper floors. A cat, thin, amber, and entirely unbothered, picked its way along the top of the opposite wall with the focused attention of a creature with somewhere specific to be. She didn't know what she'd expected Egypt to look like. She'd looked at the pictures in the holiday brochure back home, but pictures were flat and silent, and this was neither. This had weight to it. The cat reached the end of the wall, considered its options for a moment, and dropped out of sight. Bill appeared at her shoulder. "All right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "It doesn't look like the brochure." "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." They stood there for a moment, the ceiling fan turning above them, Ron making small, unconscious sounds of sleep from the sofa behind them. Somewhere in the kitchen, their mother was moving things and occasionally commenting on where she'd moved them. "Are you glad you came?" Bill asked. Ginny thought about it honestly, the way she did with him, because he always seemed to prefer that. "I think so," she said. "I think I just haven't caught up yet." Bill nodded, as though this was a reasonable answer. "It takes a day," he said. "The place makes more sense once you've slept." She turned back to the window. The cat was gone. The 2 men across the street were still talking. The woman with the basket had passed out of sight. The ceiling fan turned. Outside, Egypt continued. They had dinner on the narrow-roofed terrace as the light changed. That particular quality of late afternoon light that came in low and amber and made everything look briefly ancient. The kind of light that arrived without apology and stayed only long enough to remind you it had been there. Mrs. Weasley had produced a meal from Bill's kitchen that should not, given its contents, have been possible, and everyone agreed on this while eating it anyway. The twins had found somewhere, no one asked where, 2 bottles of something cold and fizzing that tasted of pomegranate and a very mild warming charm, and shared them without being asked. Arthur sat across from Bill, and they talked in low voices about the wall with the symbols, and Bill answered the questions with patience and some apparent pleasure, the way he did when someone wanted to understand something properly rather than just know the answer. Percy was taking notes. Ron had found a second wind after his accidental nap and was eating with the focused dedication of someone who had been awake for a long time and was fueling the next phase. Fred and George had each put on a fez, sourced from an unknown location, and were wearing them with complete sincerity. Ginny ate quietly and listened. It was not so different from home, she thought, in the ways that counted. The same voices, the same overlapping conversations, the same certainty underneath all the noise that everyone around the table was firmly located in the same place, pointed in the same direction, even when they were arguing. It was just that the light was different, and the sounds, and the sky, which had shifted now from that deep painted blue to something softer and wider and threaded through with colour along the horizon. Bill leaned back in his chair and looked up. "Stars will be out properly in about an hour," he said, to no one in particular. "How many can you see out here?" Ron asked. "More than you've ever seen?" Ron looked up at the sky with an expression that was trying to be casual and not quite getting there. The evening settled around them. Someone passed more bread. The Fez situation continued unresolved. Their father said something that made Bill laugh. A real laugh, unguarded, the kind that arrived before the decision to have it. And their mother looked at Bill for a moment with an expression Ginny recognized, but could not quite name. Something between relief and pride and the simple fact of being glad. The first star appeared, faint, tentative, like something testing the water. Ginny watched it. Somewhere below, the city was moving into its evening rhythms, which were different from its daytime rhythms, slower and lower and full of different sounds. The air had cooled slightly, not much, but enough to notice. She picked up her cup and found it still warm. A small charm, probably, the kind that kept things at the right temperature, without anyone thinking to mention it. She drank and said nothing, and watched the sky. The morning arrived before anyone was ready for it. This was not unusual in the Weasley household under any circumstances, but in Egypt it had a particular quality. The light came in early and absolute, not the gradual grey softening of an English dawn, but something immediate and decided, as though the sun had been waiting just beyond the horizon and had simply stepped through a door. By the time Ginny was fully awake, it was already bright enough that the thin curtain over the window was doing very little except existing. She lay still for a moment, listening. The house had its own morning sounds, the ceiling fan still turning somewhere, a slow and patient rhythm, and below that, the more purposeful sounds of her mother already in the kitchen, which meant it was later than it felt. A tap running, something set down on a stone surface, the small, precise sounds of someone who knew what they were doing and was doing it efficiently. From somewhere above, one of the twins was walking in circles. She could tell it was walking in circles because the footsteps were too regular to be going anywhere. She got up. Bill had planned the morning, which meant he had mentioned a direction and a rough time frame, and left the rest to develop organically. The direction was the old Wizarding Quarter. The time frame was after breakfast. Both of these things were observed technically, though the after breakfast portion extended somewhat due to a disagreement between Fred and George about who had last borrowed whose sneakoscope and whether it had been returned in its original condition. They left the house at 20 minutes past 9, which Bill accepted without comment. The walk to the Wizarding Quarter took them through 3 streets of the ordinary city. Narrow, stone-paved, the buildings close enough together that they created shade in irregular patches. Before they turned a corner, and the character of the street changed in the way that magical districts sometimes did. Not dramatically, not with any sign or barrier, but perceptibly. The quality of the light shifted, the sounds layered differently. The people walking past carried things that didn't quite behave, and no one seemed to notice or mind. A cart rolled past with no one pushing it, laden with bolts of cloth in colours that changed slightly, depending on the angle. Arthur stopped walking. "Arthur," said Mrs. Weasley, without turning around, because she had been married to him for long enough to know the sound of him stopping. "In a moment," he said. Bill steered him gently back into motion. "There's a whole market," he said. "You'll have plenty to stop at." "Is it self-propelling? What enchantment? Is it a continuous charm, or is it triggered by—" "Continuous, mostly. Some of the older vendors use triggered systems. You can ask. Some of them don't mind." Arthur's expression was the one he wore when Christmas arrived early. The market was not large by Egyptian standards, Bill explained, but it was old, and its age showed in the way markets' ages often did. Not in deterioration, but in a kind of settled confidence. The stalls arranged in patterns that had been refined over generations, the vendors knowing their spots the way people knew the shape of their own hands. It occupied a large open square and several of the streets leading off it, roofed in some sections, with fabric stretched between, buildings that filtered the light into something amber and textured. The sounds were dense and layered, voices in Arabic and something older, and the occasional burst of English when someone was directing tourists. And underneath it all, the ambient hum of things that were enchanted and active, a low collective sound like the space between notes. Mrs. Weasley navigated it with the specific confidence of someone who had survived 17 years of Diagon Alley on a budget, her bag over one arm, and her purpose clear. She was looking for gifts. She was looking for them efficiently. Ron stayed close to Bill for the first few minutes, which was understandable, and then gradually drifted outward as the market became more familiar and less overwhelming, the way people did when a new place slowly revealed its logic. Ginny moved at her own pace. She was not, in general, someone who needed to be directed. She had grown up with 6 brothers and had learned early that the most interesting things were usually to one side of wherever everyone else was looking. She drifted toward the edges of stalls rather than the fronts, and looked at what was arranged there. Not the things put forward for tourists, but the things placed back and sideways, the things that were part of the working fabric of the stall rather than its display. At one stall, an older woman was repairing an amulet with a charm Ginny didn't recognize. Her wand movements small and practiced, her attention entirely on her work. The amulet was bronze and shaped like an eye, and as the charm was applied, it caught the light in a way that suggested the light itself was doing something more than reflecting. The woman noticed Ginny watching and did not seem to object. She finished the charm, held the amulet up briefly for examination, set it down, and picked up the next one. Ginny moved on. Fred and George had, within approximately 8 minutes of entering the market, identified a stall selling what appeared to be magical novelty items of the practical joke variety. small enchanted objects whose purposes range from the merely confusing to the genuinely inadvisable, and had stationed themselves in front of it with the focused attention of professionals. The vendor, a young man of about 20 with an expression of patient good humor, watched them handle things with a tolerance that suggested he had a reliable system for ensuring nothing was pocketed without payment. "How much for the sand?" Fred asked, holding up a small glass vial containing what appeared to be ordinary desert sand, except that it was moving very slowly against gravity. 6 galleons. "What does it do?" "Fills whatever container you pour it into." George took it, turned it over. The sand moved against the tilt in a way that was pleasantly baffling. "All the way full?" "All the way. Indefinitely." The twins looked at each other. "We'll take 2, Fred said. Percy found the ministry man by accident, which was not entirely true. Percy had been keeping a peripheral awareness of the market for anyone who looked official, because the letter of introduction he had brought from his father's department was burning a hole in his inner pocket with the particular insistence of something that wanted to be used. When he spotted a tall wizard in formal robes moving through the market with the slightly uncomfortable purpose of someone on working time in a leisure environment, Percy moved to intercept with a decisiveness that his brothers would have called alarming. The wizard's name was Hassam Farouk. He was 37, a senior attaché in the Egyptian Ministry's Department of International Magical Relations, and he had come to the market on an entirely different errand. He was a polite man by disposition and professional habit, and so when this extremely tall, extremely serious, red-haired boy appeared at his elbow, letter of introduction already extended, he accepted the letter and read it. "Your father works in the misuse of Muggle artifacts office," he said. "Yes," Percy said. He's always had a great respect for international wizarding law regarding magical artifacts, and when he heard we'd be visiting— "You're on holiday?" "Yes, but I thought—" "How old are you?" Percy straightened. 16 in August. Hassam Farouk regarded him for a moment with an expression that was trying not to be amused and partially succeeding. He folded the letter carefully and returned it. "Your father's department has a counterpart here," he said, "the Regulation of Enchanted Objects Division. If your father ever wishes to initiate a formal correspondence, the contact details are on the ministry website, accessible via standard international magical directory." "I could take a name," Percy said, "for the correspondence. To facilitate." "The name," Hassam said, "is in the directory." He moved on. Percy stood where he was for a moment, letter in hand, recalibrating. Then he produced his parchment and wrote down Hassam Farouk, DIMIR, Egyptian Ministry, in careful, even letters, because it was still information, and information was never wasted. Bill found his father at a stall near the center of the market, which sold, among other things, a collection of small mechanical devices of magical origin, the kind of objects that existed at the intersection of enchantment and engineering. They were not antiques exactly, or not exclusively. Some were old, some were clearly recent in construction, but all of them operated on principles that were more architectural than purely magical. Gears and levers and small moving parts that interacted with enchantments in ways that were meant to be seen. Arthur was holding something that looked like a small brass compass, except that the needle was pointing in several directions simultaneously and each direction corresponded to a different symbol on the rim. "It's a multi-directional locator," the vendor said, in careful English. He was about 50, with reading glasses pushed up on his head and the unhurried manner of someone who preferred customers who were actually interested. Pre-20th century, probably. The enchantment structure is pre-modern, which you can see from the layering. Newer locators are single-directional, much simpler binding. "The layering is extraordinary," Arthur said, almost to himself. He was turning it over with great care. The way the enchantment sits on the mechanism, it's not separate. It's in the structure. "Integrated," the vendor agreed, nodding. "Old technique. Almost no one does it this way now. Too slow, too difficult to replicate." Bill stood slightly behind his father and watched him. There was a specific quality to Arthur Weasley when he encountered something mechanical and magical together. A quality of genuine absorption, uncomplicated by anything else. Just the pure pleasure of trying to understand how a thing worked. It was, Bill had always thought, the clearest version of his father, the one that emerged when something genuinely interesting was in his hands. "Could I?" Arthur began. "Please," the vendor said, gesturing. Arthur turned the compass slowly. The needles moved in their small, independent arcs. He brought it close to examine the rim, tilting it to catch the amber light filtering through the fabric above. Bill watched. After a while, Arthur set the compass down with some apparent reluctance. He looked at the price marked on the small card beside it. His expression did a brief, private calculation. "It's remarkable," he said to the vendor. "Genuinely remarkable." "I know," the vendor said, without boastfulness. Simply, "I know." They stood together for a moment, the three of them, the compass sitting between them. Bill paid for it. Arthur protested. Bill said it was an early birthday present. Arthur said his birthday wasn't for 3 months. Bill said that was fine. He could wait 3 months to receive it, or he could take it now. Arthur took it. Ginny found Ron near a stall, selling food at the far edge of the market. Small fried things on paper and cold drinks in bottles that sweated in the heat. He was eating with the expression of someone who had been skeptical and had been proven wrong, and he acknowledged her arrival with a sideways look and a slight tilt of the paper package in her direction. She took one. It was good, crisp and savory, and slightly spiced in a way that was new but not unwelcome. They stood side by side, eating without talking, watching the market. Across the square, their mother was examining a bolt of cloth whose pattern shifted when you looked away and back. Fred was attempting to explain something to a vendor using hand gestures that were becoming increasingly elaborate. Percy was writing on his parchment, looking satisfied in the focused, private way Percy did when he felt productive. "Bill knows everyone," Ron said. Ginny looked where Ron was looking. Bill was moving through the market at an easy pace, stopping briefly here and there. A nod to one vendor, a few words with another, a brief exchange at a third stall where he shook someone's hand, and both of them seemed to find this genuinely pleasant. He moved through the place the way people moved through spaces they actually belonged to, not like a visitor. "He's been here 1.5 years, Ginny said. "Still," Ron said. She knew what he meant. It was not a critical observation. It was just the particular strangeness of seeing a sibling in their own world, separate from the shared family world, being a person you couldn't entirely account for. She had thought about this before, in the abstract, but seeing it was different. Bill here was continuous with Bill at home, but there was more of him, or more visible of him, or perhaps just a part of him, that home didn't quite accommodate. It was not unsettling. It was, if anything, interesting. The way the compass had more needles than you expected, pointing in directions you hadn't anticipated. She finished her food. The paper was warm from the heat. "Come on," she said. "Mum will want to find us." They reassembled in the middle of the square at an hour that was closer to noon than anyone had intended, carrying various acquisitions and wearing various expressions. Mrs. Weasley had found gifts for everyone on her list. Fred and George had their sand. Arthur had his compass, which he was still holding. Percy had his notes and the residual dignity of having successfully opened and closed a professional conversation, however briefly. Ron had eaten something he liked, which put him in a reliable good mood. Bill looked at them all and did a quiet head count. "Right," he said. "Lunch, and then I want to show you something this afternoon." "What something?" Fred asked. "Something old," Bill said. "Good old or bad old?" George asked. Bill considered this with what appeared to be genuine thought. "Complicated old," he said. This was evidently acceptable, because no one objected. They followed him out of the market and back into the narrower streets, the sounds of the stalls falling behind them, the heat pressing down with midday insistence. Arthur had the compass out again and was looking at it while walking, which was the kind of thing that should have been dangerous and somehow wasn't, because he had 40 years of practice at being absorbed in things while still navigating the physical world without incident. Ginny walked near the back of the group and didn't hurry. The street was quiet here, the buildings close, a strip of bright sky overhead. Somewhere ahead, her mother was asking Bill something about his eating habits, and Bill was answering with patience. The twins were conferring in low voices about the sand. Percy was putting his parchment away with the care of someone filing something important. She looked at the walls as she passed them. Old stone, pale and worn. Here and there, carved mark, not always clear, not always readable, but present, layered into the surface of things the way old marks always were. She didn't touch them, but she looked. The afternoon light was different from the morning light. Ginny had noticed this already, in the single day and a half they had been here, that Egypt did not have one light but several, each belonging to a particular hour, each with its own quality and weight. Morning light was bright and immediate, arriving without ceremony. Midday light was simply present, flat and total, leaving no shadows worth mentioning. But the afternoon light, the light that came in from the west as the sun began its long descent, had texture to it. It caught things at angles. It made old stone look older and made distances harder to judge and turned the pale dust of the roads into something almost golden. This was the light they travelled through on the way to the site. Bill had hired 2 large enchanted vehicles, not quite cars, not quite carriages, operating on a principle he declined to explain fully, except to say that the steering responded to intention as much as to the wheel, which their father found fascinating and their mother found concerning. They drove out from the city on roads that grew gradually less maintained and then stopped being roads in the conventional sense and became tracks, and then became suggestions, and then became simply the desert itself, which accepted the vehicles without complaint. The children sat in the back of the second vehicle, all 5 of them with varying degrees of comfort, and watched the landscape change. Ron had his forehead against the window. Fred and George were playing a card game that required one of them to occasionally lean over the other, which Percy was tolerating with diminishing grace. Ginny sat with her back against the door and her knees pulled up and looked at the desert. She had not known what desert would look like. The word suggested emptiness, and it was not empty. It was full of its own things, its own texture, pale and ochre, and occasionally the dark ridge of rock breaking the surface. It was just that those things were sparse and widely spaced, and the distances between them were enormous in a way that felt deliberate, as though the desert had considered proximity and decided against it. She found, to her mild surprise, that she liked it. Bill's site was not a famous tomb. He had explained this over lunch, in the measured way he had of managing expectations without diminishing the thing itself. The famous tombs were elsewhere, were tourist sites now, were managed and roped off and visited by hundreds of people daily. What his team worked on were different, lesser-known sites, often unmarked on any public record, identified through archival research and magical survey, and occasionally through the specific instinct that experienced curse-breakers developed over years of knowing what the earth was hiding. This one had been known to his team for 8 months. They had been clearing it slowly, carefully, documenting everything before touching anything. It was not ready for entry. It might not be ready for entry for another year, but the outside could be seen. The entrance could be approached. And Bill had apparently decided that his family could handle the outside with proper guidance, which was a different calculation than most people made. The vehicle stopped at a distance from a low ridge of rock, and they got out into the afternoon air, which was warmer than the city had been, and drier in a way that was immediately noticeable at the back of the throat. There were other people here, Bill's colleagues, 3 of them, who greeted him with the easy familiarity of people who worked together in difficult conditions and had reached an arrangement with each other. They acknowledged the family with professional courtesy and then returned to what they were doing, which involved a series of instruments laid out on a folding table and a great deal of quiet consultation over a rolled-out diagram. Bill led the family toward the ridge. The entrance was not dramatic. That was perhaps the first thing. There was no grand archway, no imposing facade, no carved figures flanking a monumental doorway. There was simply a place in the rock where the rock had been shaped. A low, dark opening, perhaps 4 feet high, reinforced at its edges with stone blocks that were a slightly different color from the surrounding rock. In front of it, Bill's team had erected a temporary barrier, a series of thin copper rods driven into the earth, connected by something that was not quite rope and not quite wire, and which hummed very faintly if you stood close enough. Fred stood close enough. "It's doing something," he said. "It's a ward boundary," Bill said. "Nothing comes in, nothing goes out while the barrier's up." "Nothing comes out," Ron said, looking at the entrance. "Precautionary," Bill said, with a tone that managed to be both reassuring and entirely non-committal about what it was precautionary against. Their mother looked at the entrance for a long moment. "We're not going in," she said. It was not a question. "We're not going in," Bill confirmed. She looked at him. "I promise, Mum," he said. She looked at the entrance again, then at her husband, who was already moving toward the barrier with the careful focus of someone trying to see as much as possible from the allowable distance. And she said nothing further, which was its own kind of acceptance. They stood at the barrier and looked. The entrance was dark in a way that was not entirely explained by the absence of light. The afternoon sun was behind them, and the angle was such that it should have illuminated at least some portion of the passage within. But the darkness inside the entrance had a quality of resistance to it. It absorbed the light rather than simply being the absence of it, which was either an effect of the rock's composition or something else. Ginny looked at it steadily. "How deep does it go?" she asked. "We don't fully know yet," Bill said. He was standing at her shoulder, looking at the entrance with the particular expression he wore here, different from his expression in the city or at home. Something more careful, more attentive, the expression of someone whose professional instincts were always partly engaged in a place like this. "The first chamber is about 30 feet in. Beyond that, the passage continues, but we haven't mapped it completely. The enchantments get more complex the further in you go." "That's by design?" Arthur asked. He had his compass out, and the needles were all pointing toward the entrance with a unanimous urgency that they had not previously displayed. "Almost certainly," Bill said. He noticed the compass. "Put that away, Dad." Arthur looked at the compass, then at the entrance, then put the compass away with some reluctance. "The complexity increases as you go deeper," Bill continued, "which is consistent with what we know about the period. The outer chambers are functional, storage typically, ritual preparation space. The inner chambers are where the significant enchantments are, the ones the builders cared most about protecting." "Protecting what?" George asked. He was being serious, which happened occasionally and was always slightly surprising. Bill looked at the entrance for a moment before answering. "That's what we're trying to find out," he said, carefully. The twins had drifted, by increments, several feet to the left of the group, toward a section of the rock face, beside the entrance, where carved symbols were visible. Not hieroglyphics, or not only hieroglyphics, but an interspersed system that Ginny recognized from the wall they had passed in the city, those same angular marks appearing between the more familiar shapes. Bill noticed before their mother did, which was fortunate. "Don't touch the wall," he said, without raising his voice. Fred, who had been approximately 4 inches from touching the wall, withdrew his hand with an expression of innocence so complete it circled back around to guilt. "I was just looking," he said. "The carvings on this site have active enchantments," Bill said, in the tone of someone who had said similar things to colleagues and knew the importance of being clear. "Not dangerous if you don't interact with them. Very much dangerous if you do." "Dangerous how?" George asked. Bill considered this. "Repellent," he said. "The polite word is repellent. The more accurate description involves what happened to a member of my team in November, which I'm not going to describe in front of Mum." Mrs. Weasley's expression suggested she had already formulated 17 questions and was exercising great discipline in not asking them. The twins stepped back from the wall. Ginny had moved slightly away from the group while this was happening. Not far, not beyond any boundary she'd been given, just to the side, where the rock face curved and the carved symbols continued in a different register, smaller, more densely packed, running in a horizontal band at approximately eye level. She stood in front of them and looked without moving. They were not language, or not only language. She had seen enough of the textbooks their father kept on a high shelf at home. The ones about ancient magical traditions. The ones he read with the same absorbed expression he'd worn at the market. To know that magical notation systems were not purely linguistic. They were also structural. They were instructions for things and records of things, and sometimes they were something harder to categorize than either of those. These looked like records. She couldn't read them. She didn't expect to read them. But there was something in the pattern of them, the way they were arranged, the regularity of certain shapes appearing at intervals, that suggested they were about something specific, and that the specificity was important to whoever had put them there. She stood and looked at them for a while. Bill appeared beside her. He looked at the symbols for a moment without speaking, in the way he did when he was thinking rather than preparing to say something. Then, "We haven't fully translated this section yet. The system is a hybrid, classical hieroglyphics mixed with a magical notation that predates the dynasty this tomb is attributed to, which means either the builders were working from older sources or the dating of the tomb is wrong." "Which do you think?" Ginny asked. "Older sources," he said. "The construction technique is consistent with the attributed period, but whoever built this knew older things that were already old when they learned them." She looked at the symbols. "What kind of things?" Bill was quiet for a moment. "The kind," he said, "that people are usually trying to use when they build somewhere like this." He said it without drama, in the same measured voice he used for everything here. But there was something underneath the evenness of it, not warning exactly, not the deliberate weight of someone trying to impress, just the straightforward gravity of someone who had spent 18 months working in places like this and had developed a clear-eyed understanding of what they were for. Ginny looked at the entrance again, the dark opening in the rock, the barrier with its low hum. "Cheating death," she said. It was not a question. She had pieced it together from enough of the afternoon, the conversation at lunch, the things Bill had mentioned in passing, the way his colleague spoke about the site with a specific kind of careful respect, to arrive at this without being told directly. Bill looked at her. "Yes," he said. She nodded slowly, not because it was surprising, but because it was one of those things that needed a moment of acknowledgement before you could put it in its proper place. "Did it work?" she asked. "No," Bill said. "It never works. Not the way they want it to." Percy had found Bill's colleague, a woman named Aisha, who was the team's documentation specialist, and who had the focused, efficient manner of someone who was always slightly annoyed at how much there was still left to document. Percy had produced his parchment and was asking her questions about the ministry liaison process for archaeological sites, and she was answering him with a directness that Percy was receiving as professional respect, and which was, in fact, simply her default register. Arthur was crouched near the barrier, as close as he could get without triggering it, looking at the stone blocks framing the entrance with intense concentration and occasionally making notes on the back of an old receipt he had found in his pocket. Ron was standing near the vehicles, not quite wanting to be closer to the entrance and not quite wanting to appear unwilling. He was watching the sight from a comfortable middle distance, with his hands in his pockets and the expression of someone processing more than he would admit to. Mrs. Weasley was watching Bill. This was something she did when she could, not monitoring, not anxious exactly, but the specific attention of a parent trying to take accurate stock of a child they didn't see often enough. Bill at work was different from Bill at home, and she was doing the quiet work of reconciling these two versions, storing the reconciliation away for later. Bill caught her looking. She looked away, which meant she didn't mind him knowing. They stayed for about an hour. The light shifted as they stood there, the afternoon deepening, the shadows that the sight cast growing longer and more defined. One of Bill's colleagues began packing up the instruments on the folding table, rolling the diagram with care. The humming of the barrier remained constant. Eventually, Bill gave a signal. Nothing formal, just a slight change in his posture and a look toward the vehicles, and the family began to move. Fred and George went first, still conferring quietly about the symbols on the wall. Percy said goodbye to Aisha with a handshake she had not expected but accepted. Arthur took one last long look at the entrance, committing something to memory before turning away. Ginny was the last to go, except for Bill. She looked at the entrance one more time. The darkness behind it was unchanged, patient, dense, absorbing the last of the afternoon light without acknowledgement. She thought about the symbols on the wall, about records and instructions and things that were already old when someone learned them, about the people who had built this place and what they had wanted and how many hundreds of years had passed since they had wanted it, and how the wanting was still here, still legible in the stone, still protected by enchantments that still worked. The desert was very quiet around the site. Not the quiet of absence, but the quiet of something that had been here long enough to be finished making noise about it. She turned and walked back to the vehicles. Bill fell into step beside her. Neither of them said anything. The vehicles started, and they drove back toward the city through the long amber light, the desert spreading away on both sides, the rock formations growing smaller behind them. Ron fell asleep again, leaning against the window with the guileless totality of someone who had processed enough for one afternoon. Fred and George had gone quiet in the specific way that meant they were thinking rather than plotting, which was rare enough to be notable. Percy was writing again. Arthur had the compass out, but he wasn't looking at it. He was looking out the window at the landscape, and his expression was something Ginny couldn't quite read. She leaned her head back against the seat. The desert outside was turning a deeper color now, the light going out of the sky at its edges, the shadows pooling in the spaces between rocks. Somewhere ahead, the city would be lighting up, and the house would be there, and dinner, and the ceiling fan turning. But for now, there was just the desert, and the light, and the long way back. Dinner arrived the way dinners did when Mrs. Weasley was involved. Not as an event, but as a gradual accumulation of warmth and smell and sound. Things appearing on the table in an order that suggested a larger plan operating quietly in the background. There was bread and something slow-cooked that Bill had started in the morning before they left, and a salad that Mrs. Weasley had constructed from things she had found at the market and treated with the practical creativity of someone who had fed 8 people on an irregular budget for the better part of 2 decades. They ate on the roof terrace again. The decision had been made without discussion. Someone had carried the first things up, and everyone else had followed, because the roof was simply where you wanted to be in the evenings here. The city spread out below and around them, its sounds arriving softened by distance and height, the buildings close enough to make the terrace feel contained, but the sky above wide enough to make it feel otherwise. The heat had eased. It was still warm. It would always be warm here in summer, Bill had said, even the nights. But the specific weight of the afternoon was gone, and the air moved occasionally in small, purposeful ways that made the candles on the table gutter and straighten. Fred had found the candles somewhere, or possibly made them, and no one asked which. They were almost through the meal before Bill began talking about the tomb. Not because it had been planned. There was no particular moment where the conversation turned and someone said now, but because it was simply where things arrived. The afternoon had been full of the sight, and the sight had been full of questions, and the questions had been patient all through the drive back and through the unpacking and through the first part of dinner. And now there was food in everyone, and the city below, and the beginning of the evening sky. And it was the right time for things to be said. Arthur had asked, simply and directly, what Bill's team actually expected to find inside. Not the official documentation answer, not the ministry-facing answer, but the actual working theory. Bill looked at his plate for a moment. Then he set down his fork. "There's a family name we keep encountering in the records," he said. "Not consistently. It appears and disappears across different periods, different sources, written differently each time in ways that might be translation drift or might be intentional obscuring. But the same family, or the same claim to a family." "What family?" Percy asked. He had his parchment out, which everyone had accepted by this point as simply Percy's way of being present. "We're calling them the Imhotari," Bill said. "For now. It may not be the name they used. It's what our linguist constructed from the recurring root across the variants." He picked up his cup. "They were significant. We know that much. The kind of significant that gets written about by other people, which is usually a more reliable indicator than what people write about themselves." "Significant how?" Ginny asked. "Magically powerful," Bill said. "Over multiple generations, which is unusual. Power tends to dilute. You get one exceptional generation, occasionally 2, and then it disperses. The Imhotari appear to have maintained it across at least 4 generations that we can document, possibly more." "How?" Arthur asked. Bill was quiet for a moment. The candle nearest to him moved in a breath of air and steadied. "That," he said, "is the question the tomb is supposed to answer, or one version of it. The other version of the question, it is whether what they were doing to maintain it constitutes magic in the sense we'd currently recognize, or something else." "Something else meaning what?" Fred asked. He was not being facetious. He was listening in the way both twins occasionally listened, not loudly, but with a completeness of attention that was easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. Meaning, the kind of thing that stops being magic and starts being something we don't have a clean category for, Bill said. He said it without drama. the way he said most things about his work, as though the subject matter's weight was best carried lightly. There's a line in the older traditions between using magic and trying to become the source of it. Most wizards and witches stay on the use side of that line without ever really thinking about it. It's the natural relationship. You have magic. You use it. It's a capacity like any other. And the Imhotari, Ginny said. We think, Bill said, that they tried to cross the line. The city below had softened further. The first proper stars were visible now, not tentative as they'd been the night before, but settled, as though they'd been waiting for the right hour and had found it. Mrs. Weasley refilled cups without being asked, moving around the table in the quiet, efficient way she had, and sat back down and said nothing, which meant she was listening. There are other families, Bill said. This is what I want you to understand. The Imhotari are significant, partly because they're well documented, or as well documented as anything from that period gets. But they're not unique. We encounter versions of the same story repeatedly across different dynasties, different periods, different parts of the magical world's history. The same story being, Percy said, his quill poised. Families who had power, Bill said, and who decided that having power wasn't enough, who looked at the natural limits on magical ability, the fact that it's finite in a human lifetime, that it doesn't accumulate the way wealth does, that you can't pass it on intact the way you can pass on gold or land, and decided those limits were a problem to be solved rather than a condition to be lived with. They wanted it to be inherited, Arthur said slowly. More than that, Bill said. They wanted it to be preserved. The inheritance part was one attempt. Selective marriages, controlled lineages, the whole bloody history of pure blood thinking in its oldest form. But even that has limits, because magic doesn't follow bloodlines with the tidiness people want it to. You can't guarantee the outcome. And the Imhotari, from what we can tell, were not people who accepted not being able to guarantee the outcome. The terrace was quiet for a moment, except for the sounds of the city below and the occasional flutter of a candle. So they tried something else, Ginny said. Several something elses, Bill said. Over several generations, each one more involved than the last, which is also a pattern we see repeatedly. The escalation. The first attempts are relatively contained. They don't work completely, or they work partially and then stop working. And so the next generation tries something larger, something that goes further into the territory we don't have clean categories for. What kind of attempts? George asked. Bill considered. The earlier ones are almost recognizable, he said. Long life enchantments layered onto the family bloodline. Magical preservation of certain objects tied to the family's power, with the idea that the objects would anchor the magic across generations. Rituals at particular times of year designed to reinforce the family's connection to something older and more stable than individual human lives. He paused. None of these are inherently dark, by the way. Similar things have been tried by dozens of families across history. Most of them don't work the way people hope, but they're within the range of things that people try. But later, Ron said. He had been quiet all through dinner, sitting between Ginny and their father, eating steadily and listening with an attentiveness that he displayed when things genuinely caught him. Later, Bill agreed. It becomes something different. The later attempts, and this is what we think the inner chambers are about, based on what we've found in the outer ones. The later attempts are about the people themselves, not their bloodline, not their objects. The people. He was quiet for a moment. There are ways, he said carefully, of trying to preserve a person beyond the natural end of a life. Not resurrection. That's different and doesn't work. And the reasons it doesn't work are fundamental enough that we don't spend much professional time worrying about it. But extension, suspension, the attempt to not avoid death, exactly, but to defer it, or to make the thing that remains when you defer it still meaningfully you. The table was very quiet. Percy had stopped writing. And the cost of that, Ginny said, is what the tomb is full of. Bill looked at her. He had, she thought, a particular way of looking at her when she arrived at something ahead of where he expected. Not surprised exactly, but attentive in a different way. Yes, he said, the people who tried these things. And this is true across all the families, not just the Imhotari. They paid for them, not always immediately. Sometimes the payment came a generation later, or 2 generations, which made it difficult to connect cause and effect, which may have been part of why people kept trying despite the evidence. He picked up his cup. But they paid. How? Percy asked. He had his quill ready again, but more tentatively than before. Bill was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet, Ginny understood that he was deciding how much to say, with their mother sitting 2 places to his left, and Ron and the twins at the table. The magic turns, he said, finally. That's the simplest way to describe it. Magic it's a relationship with the person who has it and with the world they're in it. When you try to take more than your share of that relationship, when you try to fix it or force it or extend it past what it naturally is, the relationship changes. It becomes something that takes rather than gives. It starts working against the person who tried to own it. He set his cup down. The Imhotari's last documented generation, he said, were not recognizably the family they had been 4 generations earlier. What the enchantments preserved was not what they intended to preserve. The records we have, written by a scribe who worked for the family and who survived them, describe something that is very difficult to read. We pass it around the team sometimes, new translations, trying to make sure we're reading it correctly. We usually arrive at the same conclusion. He stopped. The tomb is partly a monument, and partly a warning, and partly a very elaborate attempt to contain what was left. The city below made its small, continuous sounds. Fred and George were both looking at the table. Ron was looking at Bill with an expression that was trying to be neutral. Their father had his hands flat on the table in a way that meant he was thinking about something with his whole body. Mrs. Weasley said, quietly, "And this is what you work around every day?" Bill looked at her. "It's what I work to understand," he said. "It's different." "Is it?" she asked. It was not an argument. It was a genuine question, asked in the tone of someone who wanted an honest answer, rather than a reassuring one. Bill thought about it. "I think so," he said. "Understanding something and being endangered by it aren't the same thing, most of the time." A pause. "We're careful." Mrs. Weasley looked at him for a moment longer, then looked at her cup, then picked it up, which was, Ginny knew, Her mother's way of deciding to accept something she didn't fully accept. The stars had come fully out while Bill was talking. Ginny noticed this the way you noticed things that happened gradually. Not a single moment, but an accumulation that crossed a threshold somewhere. And then you looked up, and there they were, properly there, the sky dense with them in a way that the English sky, even on its best nights, never quite managed. She looked up. The sheer quantity of them was difficult to process at first, not because it was overwhelming in an unpleasant way, but because it required a recalibration, an adjustment of scale that the brain resisted briefly before accepting. The sky here was simply larger than she had understood sky to be. It was the same sky that was over the Borough and over Hogwarts and over London, the same continuous sky, but it didn't look like the same sky. "There they are," Bill said, following her gaze upward. No one said anything for a while. The candles had burned lower. The city below had shifted into its later evening. Even Percy had put his parchment away. Ron did the same. Even Percy had put his parchment away. Ron was still looking at Bill. "The families who tried those things," Ron said. "The ones who kept going even when they could see it wasn't working. Why did they keep going?" Bill looked at him. "Because stopping meant accepting the thing they'd started all this to avoid," he said. "Once you've spent that much trying to defeat something, the defeat feels like it means something about you, about whether you deserve to win." He shook his head very slightly. "It never means anything about whether you deserve to win, but it feels like it does. And that feeling is what makes people keep going past the point where any reasonable reading of the evidence would tell them to stop." Ron was quiet. He turned and looked up at the stars. The table sat in its comfortable disorder of finished plates and half-empty cups and the detritus of a good meal. Their mother had her hands around her cup, looking at nothing in particular. Their father was looking at the sky with the same expression he'd worn looking out of the vehicle window on the way back from the site. Something large and quiet sitting behind his eyes. Ginny looked at the stars and thought about the Immortari, and about the scribe who had survived them, and about the records that Bill's team passed around, trying to make sure they were reading them correctly, and about the darkness at the entrance of the tomb that absorbed light rather than simply being the absence of it. She thought about 4 generations of a family that had wanted something badly enough to keep going past every reasonable point. She thought, without knowing entirely why, about what it felt like to want something that much. The thought arrived without judgment, just with the specific curiosity she applied to things that were difficult to understand from the outside. People were not usually senseless. Even when they did senseless things, there was usually a logic inside the senselessness, a shape to it that made sense from somewhere you couldn't quite access from where you were standing. She didn't resolve it. She just held it there while she looked at the sky. A candle went out. Fred lit it again, without comment, with a small, wordless flick of his wand that he did not appear to think about. The flame steadied. The stars remained. Arthur Weasley did not sleep as late as his children. This had always been true, at home and away. The habit of early rising was so deeply embedded in him that it operated independently of fatigue or holiday, or the particular warmth of a foreign morning pressing through the window. He woke before the light was fully decided In that early hour when the sky was still working out what color it intended to be, and lay for a moment listening to the sounds of the house, the ceiling fan, distant city, somewhere, one of the twins turning over with the unconscious completeness of deep sleep. He got up quietly, found his dressing gown on the chair where Molly had placed it the night before, with the efficiency of someone who knew his habits, and went downstairs to the kitchen, where he put a kettle on and stood at the window while it heated. The street was not empty, even at this hour. A man walked past with a cart. A cat, possibly the same amber cat Ginny had watched from this window the morning before, though he couldn't be certain, was sitting in the precise center of the opposite doorstep and cleaning its face with a methodical thoroughness that suggested a serious commitment to the task. Arthur made his tea and stood with it and watched the street come gradually more awake. He was thinking about the compass. Bill came downstairs at 6:30, already dressed, with his satchel over his shoulder and the air of someone whose body had long since made its peace with early hours. He stopped when he saw his father at the kitchen table with the compass in front of him and a cup of tea going cold at his elbow. Arthur looked up. "I've been looking at the binding," he said. Bill set down his satchel and came to look. The compass sat between them, its needles doing their slow, independent rotations in the early morning quiet. In the kitchen light, they were clearer than they had been in the market, fine brass, worn at their tips, moving with a smoothness that spoke of very old enchantment, the kind that had been running so long it had settled into itself. "The integration," Arthur said. "The way the enchantment sits inside the mechanism rather than on top of it. I've been trying to work out the technique, and I can't." He looked up at Bill. "How did they do it?" Bill sat down. "We don't fully know," he said. "The working theory is that it's a casting method we don't use anymore. Not lost, exactly. More like superseded. Modern enchantment casting applies the magic to an object after it's constructed. This," he nodded at the compass, "was constructed around the enchantment. The mechanism was built to the magic shape rather than the other way around." Arthur looked at him. "Built to the magic shape," he repeated slowly, as though tasting the phrase. "The enchantment was fixed first," Bill said, "as a kind of a scaffold, I suppose. And then the physical components were constructed around it, fitted to it, calibrated to its specific properties, which is why they can't be separated. The mechanism and the enchantment are structurally continuous." Arthur picked up the compass with both hands. He turned it slowly, his reading glasses now retrieved from his dressing gown pocket and perched on his nose, bringing it close to examine the point where the needle housing met the rim. "You'd have to know the enchantment completely," he said, "before you started building. Every parameter, you'd have to hold the whole thing in your mind and build to it, like building a house to fit the furniture." "Yes," Bill said, "that's extraordinary." "The people who made these things were extraordinary," Bill said. "Not in a mystical sense, just technically. The level of precision involved, the planning required, the understanding of how magical and physical structures interact. It was a different tradition of magical craftsmanship. We have nothing equivalent now." Arthur set the compass down gently. He looked at it for a long moment. "We lost it," he said. "We replaced it," Bill said. "The modern methods are faster, more replicable, easier to teach at scale. If you want to produce enchanted objects in quantity, integrated casting is essentially impossible. Too slow, too dependent on individual skill, too variable. Binding after construction is standardized, teachable. You can train 50 people to do it adequately. But not this. You couldn't train 50 people to do this, Bill agreed. You might find one in a generation who could learn it. Maybe not even that. Arthur looked at the compass. How many of these are there? He asked. Extant. We don't know. The ones that survive are mostly in private collections or museum holdings that don't get studied very often. My team has catalogued 11 in Egypt alone, in various conditions, over the last 18 months. There are probably more we haven't found, and more that have been lost entirely. Bill picked up his cup. The ones we find in the sites are usually the reason the sites were built, not the purpose. The purpose is usually more complicated, but the objects themselves are frequently why the location was chosen. The makers wanted to be buried near things they'd made. That makes sense, Arthur said quietly, as though this was simply true. If you'd made something like this, you'd want it close. Bill looked at his father. There was something in Arthur's face that Bill recognized but didn't see often enough to take for granted. The quality of complete, genuine engagement, the expression of a man who was not performing interest but experiencing it, who had asked about the compass not to be polite or to participate in conversation, but because he actually needed to know the answer. It was the expression of someone for whom understanding was not instrumental, but simply intrinsically the point. Bill had inherited this from him. He knew this. He had known it since he was 11 and had taken apart a broken Muggle wristwatch to see how it worked and had felt, in the act of seeing, something close to joy. He had not always known that it was something you could inherit. After breakfast, a loud, overlapping affair that eventually resolved into everyone being fed. Bill took Arthur alone. This had been arranged the night before, quietly, in a brief exchange between them, while the others were carrying things downstairs from the roof. Bill had said there was something he wanted to show him. Just him, if he was interested. Arthur had said he was interested before Bill had finished the sentence. They took one of the vehicles, just the two of them, and drove in a direction different from the previous afternoon. Not toward the valley where the main site was, but along a different track, toward a lower outcropping of rock about 40 minutes from the city. Arthur sat in the passenger seat with the compass in his hand and watched the desert go past. "Did you always know you wanted to do this?" he asked. "The curse breaking." Bill kept his eyes on the track. "Not curse breaking specifically," he said. "I knew I wanted to be somewhere things were old. Does that make sense? I was never very interested in making new things. I wanted to understand things that already existed, how they came to be, what decisions went into them." "You were always like that," Arthur said. "Even very young. You used to disassemble things." "I still do." "That's different from your brothers," Arthur said. "They make things, Fred and George particularly. They're always constructing something. Even Percy, in his way, is building frameworks. You are always taking things apart." "And putting them back together," Bill said. "When you could," Arthur agreed, without criticism. "Not always." Bill smiled slightly. "Not always," he admitted. The track had grown rougher, and he navigated a section of larger rocks, with the easy competence of someone who had driven this way before. On either side, the desert stretched away, the rock formations here more irregular than near the main site, the landscape older looking, if that were possible, more weathered, more folded, as though it had been here long enough to have opinions about the people passing through it. "The place we're going," Bill said, "is a restored chamber. Not from the Imhotari site. Different, smaller, probably earlier. My team found it about a year ago during a survey. It's been cleared and documented, and the enchantments have been assessed and marked. It's safe to enter. You said yesterday that the Imhotari site isn't ready. This one is different. The builders of this chamber didn't try to do what the Imhotari did. What they built was, I think you'll understand when you see it. It's harder to explain." Arthur looked out at the desert. "Are there things you find that are simply, that were made with no other purpose than making them?" he asked. "Not protection, not preservation, just the thing itself." Bill thought about this. "Yes," he said. "Less often, but yes. Some of the best ones are like that. Objects and spaces that were made because someone wanted to make them, with everything they had, and whatever they put into the making is still there, still operating, because it was done so well." He paused. "Those are the ones I like best. The ones where you can tell that the maker was happy doing it. There's a quality to them. Hard to describe technically. You just know it when you find it." Arthur said nothing, but his expression suggested that he understood exactly what Bill meant and was pleased that it existed. The chamber was set into a low hillside, the entrance here more deliberate than the Imhotari site, framed with carved stone that had been cleaned and consolidated by Bill's team, the symbols around it documented and assessed and marked with small neutral tags that noted their status and properties. Bill spoke briefly to the warden, a young witch from his team who was stationed here on rotation, and then led Arthur inside. The passage was low, requiring them to duck for the first few feet, and then it opened. Arthur straightened and stopped. The chamber was not large, perhaps 20 feet across, roughly circular, but its ceiling was higher than the entrance suggested, and what covered that ceiling was the reason Bill had brought him here. The entire surface was mapped, not with paintings, or not only with paintings, with a system of inlaid lines and symbols that caught the light from the small lamps Bill's team had installed at careful intervals, and which, in that light, moved. Not the obvious movement of something enchanted to be dramatic, but a subtle, continuous shifting. The lines repositioning by increments so small that you could not catch the moment of movement, only the fact of change. A star map, Arthur understood, after a moment. A magical star map, recording something that was still recording, still updating, still tracking whatever it had been set to track when it was made. He stood with his head back and looked at it for a long time. "The enchantment was cast first," Bill said quietly, "and then the chamber was built to contain it. The ceiling is the mechanism. The whole room was constructed to house this." Arthur turned slowly on the spot, looking up at the edges of the map, where the lines reached down toward the walls. "What does it track?" he asked. His voice was careful, the way it was when something mattered. "We're still working it out," Bill said. "It's not purely astronomical. There are elements that correspond to known star positions across different periods, some that match current configurations, some that are centuries old. But there are elements that don't correspond to anything in our stellar records, which means either our records are incomplete or it's tracking something that isn't strictly astronomical. Magical movements, Arthur said. That's our working theory. Some confluence of magical and astronomical events treated as a single system. Bill looked up at the ceiling. Whoever made this believed the two were connected in a way we don't currently map. Were they right? Bill was quiet for a moment. We don't know, he said. We don't have a framework for testing it. The enchantment is still operating as designed after, we think, somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 years, which is extraordinary by any measure. Whether what it's tracking is real in the sense we'd recognize, or whether it was real in a sense the makers understood that we've lost, that's a question we can't answer yet. Arthur looked at a section near the wall where several lines converged in a complex node, symbols clustered around it densely. The movement in this section more visible than elsewhere, a gentle circulation. It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen, he said plainly. Bill looked at him. Yes, he said. That's why I wanted you to see it. They stood there together in the low lamplight, looking up at the ceiling of the chamber while it did its slow, patient, continuous work, tracking whatever it had always tracked, completely indifferent to the two red-haired men standing beneath it. Arthur put his hand in his pocket and found the compass. He held it without taking it out. The ceiling moved in its incremental, unhurried way. The person who made this, Arthur said eventually, understood something. Yes, Bill said. Something worth spending a lifetime on. Yes. Arthur was quiet. The chamber was quiet around them, except for the faint sound of the lamps and the very slight sound, barely perceptible, that the enchanted ceiling made as it turned. A sound at the very edge of hearing, like something breathing slowly in a large and peaceful room. Thank you for bringing me, Arthur said. It was said simply, without ceremony, in the voice he used for things that were genuinely meant. Bill looked up at the ceiling. I knew you'd want to see it, he said. They stayed for another half hour, and neither of them said very much, and it was enough. On the drive back, Arthur held the compass again and looked at the desert, and the desert looked back in its impersonal and ancient way, and the track unrolled ahead of them through the pale morning heat. Bill, Arthur said at some point. Yes, I'm glad you're here. I mean, I know your mother worries. I do too, in my way. But I'm glad this is what you're doing. Glad you found it. Bill kept his eyes on the track. I know, he said. They drove on. The city appeared on the horizon, its buildings assembling themselves gradually out of the haze, and above it the sky was enormous and blue and full of whatever it was always full of, visible or not, tracked or untracked, continuing in its own deep and patient way. The idea had been Bill's, proposed over lunch, with the casualness of someone who had already made the practical arrangements and was now presenting the decision as a suggestion. There's a place, he said, passing bread to Ron without looking up. About an hour outside the city. No light, no noise to speak of. I thought we might go tonight, if people wanted. Fred looked up. What kind of place? Desert, Bill said. Just desert. But the stars. He stopped, seemed to decide that description would not serve the purpose, and said instead, You'll understand when you see it. This was, by now, a phrase they had come to recognize as Bill's particular form of recommendation. He did not oversell things. He did not build them up with superlatives or promises. He simply said, "You'll understand when you see it." And so far, this had proven reliable enough that no one questioned it. Mrs. Weasley asked about the ground and whether there would be somewhere to sit. And Bill said he'd bring blankets and a few folding chairs and something hot to drink. She asked about insects. He said there were some, but manageable. She considered this with the expression she wore when she was deciding whether the inconvenience of a thing was outweighed by its value. And then she said, fine, they'd go. They left at 8:30. The vehicles again, loaded now with folded blankets and a large flask and a basket that their mother had packed with the focused efficiency of someone who felt better when she had prepared for eventualities. The twins had brought their own things, which they did not disclose, and which clinked occasionally as they loaded them. The city thinned as they drove, not abruptly, but in stages, the buildings becoming lower and more spread out, then the spaces between them growing, then the buildings becoming occasional, then not there. The road held for longer than the previous afternoons, and then gave way to track, and then to the desert proper, which received them as it always did, without comment. The sky had changed by the time they arrived. Even inside the vehicles, even through glass, it was visible, a deepening that had been happening all through the drive, the blue darkening through its register towards something that was not quite black, the stars arriving first as suggestions and then as certainties. Bill stopped the vehicles at a place that seemed, to everyone except him, identical to all the surrounding places, and got out, and everyone else got out after him, and they stood on the pale earth and looked up. It was several seconds before anyone spoke. The quiet was the first thing, not the quiet of absence. The desert at night was not silent exactly. There were sounds, small and peripheral and hard to identify, but a quiet of scale, the sense of being in a space so large that sound could not get much purchase on it. The sounds that existed were swallowed almost immediately by the distance in all directions, and what remained was something closer to stillness than any of them had encountered before. The second thing was the sky. Ginny had looked at the stars from the roof terrace the previous 2 nights, and they had been remarkable, more than any sky she'd seen before. But the roof terrace had the city around it, the ambient light of 10,000 windows and street lamps, the glow that any inhabited place produced, unavoidable and pervasive. Here there was none of that. Here the sky was what it was when nothing competed with it. She stood with her head tilted back and said nothing. The stars were not just more numerous, they were more present. They occupied the sky in a way that made the concept of the sky as background, as setting, as the thing above things, feel insufficient. The sky here was not behind anything. It was simply there, complete and dense and covering everything, and the earth beneath her feet was a small and specific thing within it. Ron made a sound. Not a word, just a sound, low and involuntary. The sound of someone whose expectation has been exceeded in a way that has temporarily displaced language. Fred, standing next to George, said quietly, "Oh," and then nothing for a while. Bill spread blankets on the ground and set up the folding chairs, 4 of them for the adults and Percy, who accepted one with the air of someone who felt that chairs were appropriate, regardless of setting. The twins settled on blankets immediately, lying flat on their backs with their arms behind their heads, looking straight up. Ron sat for a moment on the edge of a blanket and then did the same. Ginny walked a little way from the group. Not far. She could still hear her mother settling into a chair and asking Bill where the flask was, but far enough to have a small edge of private space. She sat down on the earth, which was still warm from the day's heat, a warmth rising up through the fabric of her robes, and she looked up. She had been thinking since the tomb, since Bill's conversation at dinner the night before, about continuity, about the way things persisted, the enchantment in the chamber with her father, still operating after 3,000 years, still tracking whatever it had always tracked, the carved symbols on the tomb wall, still active, still doing what they were designed to do, the darkness at the entrance that absorbed light rather than simply being the absence of it, and the Imhotari, who had wanted so badly to persist themselves. She was not sure what the difference was between the things that persisted well and the things that persisted badly, between the ceiling of that chamber, beautiful and patient and continuous, and the whatever it was that the Imhotari had left behind in their inner chambers, that Bill's team passed around their translated records of with a carefulness that spoke of something difficult to read. She thought it might have something to do with what the thing was for. The ceiling was for tracking, for watching, for the long, patient work of paying attention to something larger than any individual life. The Imhotari's attempts were for themselves, for the continuation of their own particular selves, their own power, their own certainty that they mattered enough to be preserved. She was not sure this was entirely right, but it was somewhere in the direction of right. The stars were very still, or appeared still. She knew they were not still, that everything up there was moving at speeds that made the word movement feel inadequate, that the light reaching her eyes had left its sources thousands, and in some cases millions of years ago, and was only now arriving. The sky she was looking at was not the sky as it currently was. It was the sky as it had been across an enormous span of time, all arriving simultaneously, a composite of different moments laid over each other. She found this, for reasons she could not entirely articulate, comforting. Bill poured from the flask, something hot and sweet and spiced in a way that was distinctly Egyptian, that Mrs. Weasley had asked about at the market and been given a recipe for which she had adjusted immediately in ways that were distinctly her own. He carried cups out to those who wanted them, moving easily in the dark. He sat down near Ginny, not quite beside her, but within easy conversation distance, and looked up. After a while he said, "There's a thing I tell people when they ask why some magic is meant to remain buried." Ginny waited. "The standard professional answer," he said, "is about containment, safety. The idea that some enchantments are too unstable or too dangerous to disturb, and the people who built them understood this and sealed them deliberately, which is true often enough. It's not wrong. But," Ginny said, "but it's incomplete." He was quiet for a moment. "The better answer, I think, is about intention, what a thing was made to do, and whether disturbing it serves that purpose or defeats it." He picked up his cup. The Imhotari's inner chambers, whatever is in there, whatever they left behind, it's not contained because it's dangerous in the way a cursed object is dangerous. It's contained because it's the record of a failure, a very old very serious failure. And there's a question about whether opening it, exposing it, taking it out of its context helps anyone understand that failure better, or whether it just brings the failure back into contact with the world where it has no useful function. That's a harder calculation, Ginny said. Yes, Bill said. Most of the important calculations are. He looked up at the sky. Some things should be left where they ended, he said. Not because they're dangerous, necessarily, and not because they don't have things to teach. They do. But because the ending is part of the meaning. You disturb the ending and you change what it means. He paused. The Imhotari wanted to defeat ending altogether, and what they produced in trying was something that had no meaning at all. Not the kind of meaning that persists usefully, the way those stars are persisting. Just duration without purpose, which is its own kind of terrible. Ginny looked at the stars. The ceiling, she said. In the chamber you showed Dad. That persists usefully. Yes, because it's still doing what it was made to do. Yes, she thought about this. And the stars, she said. They're not made for anything. They don't have a purpose. They're just there. And yet, Bill said. And yet, she agreed. She didn't know how to finish the thought, and it didn't seem to need finishing. They sat with it in the way you sometimes could, with a thought that was too large for a sentence. Not unresolved exactly, but larger than resolution, requiring a different kind of relationship than agreement or disagreement. Behind them, the family had settled into its evening configuration. Their father and mother were in adjacent chairs, their mother with her cup held in both hands and her head slightly back, looking at the sky with an expression of private recognition, as though the sky was confirming something she had always suspected. Their father was talking quietly to himself, or possibly to their mother, about constellations, identifying them by name in the specific fond way of someone who knew them well and was happy to see them. Percy had his parchment out, which in the dark was impressive more than anything else. He was writing by the faint light of a small charm he had cast on his wand, balanced on his knee, making notes about something that would presumably make sense in the morning. Fred and George were still flat on their backs. George had one arm extended, pointing at something. Fred was following the direction of the point with his eyes. They were talking in the low, synchronized way they had when they were engaged in something together and had stopped performing for any audience. Ron had gone very still. This was notable enough that Ginny looked at him. He was lying on his back with his arms at his sides, not behind his head the way he'd arranged them initially, and his face was tipped straight up at the sky. He was not asleep. She could tell from the set of his shoulders a particular quality of wakeful stillness. He was just looking, with a completeness of attention that he rarely showed except in chess, and that he would probably not acknowledge in the morning if anyone mentioned it. She looked at him for a moment and felt something she didn't have a precise name for, something warm and a little rueful and very fond. The feeling of watching someone you loved be surprised into their own depth. She looked back up at the sky. The flask made another round. Their mother said something to their father in a voice too low to carry, and he laughed, the same quiet, unguarded laugh she had heard from Ginny the first night on the roof terrace, the one that arrived before the decision to have it. Fred said, without preamble, "Bill, If you found something in a tomb, something that was still operating, doing what it was made to do, but what it was made to do was something bad, what would you do? There was a pause. That's the question, Bill said. I know it's the question. That's why I'm asking it. Another pause. It depends on what bad means, Bill said, and what operating means, and what the alternative to leaving it alone would produce. Those three things together give you the answer, but the answer is always specific. There's no general rule that holds. You'd have to decide each time, George said. Yes, Bill said. That sounds exhausting, Fred said. It is, Bill agreed. That's why we have a team. George laughed, a real one, short and genuine. Their mother told them all not to be up too late, which she said to the sky generally, as though addressing all 7 of her children and the desert simultaneously. At some point, without a decision being made, the talking stopped. Not because it ran out. Conversations in the Weasley family rarely ran out. They simply paused and circled and reconvened. But because the sky was sufficiently extraordinary that it eventually made talking feel like the lesser activity. One by one, by increments, the voices went quiet, and what remained was the desert and the stars and the small human warmth of the family arranged on blankets and chairs in the enormous dark. Ginny lay back on the earth. The ground was warm still, the day's heat preserved in the soil, and the air above was cool enough to notice at the edges. She pulled her blanket up slightly without sitting up, adjusting by feel, and looked straight up. The stars did not move, or appeared not to move. She knew better now. She knew about light leaving its source thousands of years ago and arriving only now, about everything up there moving at speeds that defeated ordinary vocabulary. She had sat with Bill and thought about the Imhotari and about things that persisted usefully and things that persisted without purpose and about endings being part of meaning. And yet the sky looked still, looked patient, looked from here like something that had always been there and would always be there, vast and indifferent and beautiful in the way that only very large things could be beautiful. Not because they were made for you, not because they cared, but because they simply were, completely and without apology, in a way that put your own particular life in proportion without diminishing it. She stayed awake for a long time, looking up. The stars continued. Somewhere to her left, Ron's breathing had gone slow and even. George was saying something to Fred in a murmur she couldn't make out. Her father had gone quiet, though she could hear from the rhythm of his breathing that he was still awake. A long time later, Bill said, quietly, to no one in particular, "We should head back soon." No one moved immediately. Then, by small increments, people began to sit up, to fold blankets, to find their cups. Her mother stood and stretched with the small sounds of someone who had been sitting longer than was comfortable and was philosophical about it. Percy capped his ink. The twins rose from the ground with the fluid ease of people whose joints had not yet accumulated opinions. Ginny sat up last. She looked at the sky one more time before getting to her feet. The stars were exactly where they had been. They would be there tomorrow, and the night after, and for nights that extended further than she had the vocabulary to describe. She stood. The desert was warm under her feet, and the sky was full above her. And behind her, the family was assembling itself with its familiar noise and its familiar warmth, and everything was where it was supposed to be. She picked up her blanket and walked back to the vehicles. The last morning arrived without announcement. Ginny noticed it when she woke. The light through the curtain was the same as every morning before it, immediate and decided, the ceiling fan turning with its patient rhythm. And yet she lay still for a moment longer than usual, not from tiredness, but from the particular reluctance of someone who understands that getting up means beginning the process of leaving. She lay and listened to the house. Her mother was already in the kitchen. Above, one of the twins was walking with purpose, which meant packing. She got up. Breakfast was warm and overlapping. Bread and eggs, and the last of the spiced tea her mother had been rationing carefully through the week. Bill sat at the table with a cup in his hands. Ron came down looking mildly surprised to find himself in Egypt again, and ate with his usual dedication. The twins arrived with their trunks already packed and hovering in the corridor behind them. Percy came at 7:15, as he had every morning, fully dressed and carrying his satchel. Their father came last, his compass in his hand, turning it over with the automatic attention of a new habit. He sat down, accepted his tea, and looked around the table at his family with an expression he mostly managed to keep ordinary. "Last morning," Bill said. Arthur turned the compass once and put it in his pocket. The house unmade itself gradually, the way houses did when families prepared to leave. Robes folded, trunks closed, rooms becoming less inhabited and more simply rooms. Ginny packed efficiently, leaving one thing out until last. A small piece of pale ochre stone she had found near the vehicles on the afternoon of the tomb visit, smooth on one face and rough on the other. She wrapped it in the corner of a sock and placed it carefully at the top of her trunk. Ron found her on the roof terrace an hour before the port key. He stood at the wall and looked at the city going about itself below, indifferent to their departure. "Strange to think it'll just continue," he said. "It was continuing before we got here," Ginny said. He was quiet for a moment. "Do you think Bill ever misses home?" She looked at the city. "I think he has a different home now. I don't think that means he doesn't miss the old one." Ron considered this with a quietness that was more private than his usual manner. Then their mother called from below, and they went downstairs. They walked to the departure point through the morning streets, all 8 of them, trunks hovering in procession behind them. The city was warm already, its sounds layered and familiar in a way they hadn't been on arrival. Ginny walked at the back and looked at the carved marks in the walls as she passed them. The amber cat was on a wall. It watched their procession with the serene disinterest of a creature that had watched a great many things pass. She looked at it. It looked at her. Then it found something in the middle distance more worthy of attention. She continued walking. The goodbyes were thorough, as they always were. Fred and George each embraced Bill in their particular way. Fred formally first, and then not. Percy said something quiet that Ginny didn't catch, and Bill nodded, and that was that. Ron held up the piece of carved limestone Bill had pressed into his hand on the first evening. "Thanks for the stone," he said. "It's from the cleared site," Bill said. "Nothing active, just old." Ron looked at it for a moment and put it back in his pocket. Their father held Bill for a long moment, hand briefly on his shoulder after. Nothing said. Their mother looked at him in her complete way, the expression Ginny had never quite found the name for, the one that held relief and pride and the plain fact of being glad. "You look settled," she said. "I am," Bill said. She touched his face once and dropped her hand. "Write more." "I'll try." Ginny was last. "All right?" Bill asked. The same question he had asked on the first evening at the window. She thought about the tomb and the star-mapped ceiling and the desert at night and the conversation about things that persisted usefully. She thought about her father in the sitting room, holding his compass and looking at the ceiling fan. She thought about the cat, looking away. "Yes," she said. She looked at him for a moment. Her brother in his sand-colored robes, in his country, belonging to it. "Will you show me the chamber?" she asked. "When I come back, the one with the ceiling." Bill looked at her. "Yes," he said. She stepped back to the group and took hold of the port key and felt the pull of it engage, and the pale scrubland and the wide sky, and Bill standing in the morning light moved away faster and faster until there was nothing but the movement itself. Bill stood where they had been. The scrubland was empty. The city's sound reached him, distant and continuous, the sound of a place that had watched a great many departures without adjusting its pace. He picked up the port key from the ground and put it in his satchel. He looked at the pale earth for a moment. Then he adjusted the strap of his satchel and turned toward the city and walked back the way he had come, through the morning light, back toward the work that was waiting. Egypt received him, as it always did, without comment.